Fantastic. Welcome to Emerging Sciences Victoria. We are a virtual science school based out of Melbourne, Australia, and we are hoping to run a really cool session for you guys today. I'm really excited to be this. My name's Jade Bohni, by the way.
I'm Krystal de Napoli.
Yeah, and we've got some few things planned for you today. If we could, it's great to see so many of you joining us. It'd be really helpful for us here if we could just get maybe the names of your schools and perhaps an indication of how many students are joining us from each school, just so that we can know how to direct our questions. That would be great, and we'll get started. Excellent. Oh, I can see Venimo Secondary School, and I can see all the students. Hi there, everyone. That's great that we can see the video. It's really helpful, but we understand that if you can't put your video in, that's not a problem at all. Oh, there's is it Betty Moom? I'm not sure is that the name of the school?
Cool.
That's fantastic, Venimo Secondary. Cool. So you've got 3 students with you and 5 teaching staff. It's great to meet you all. Excellent. And see a few people typing some things into the chat feed. Gumine Secondary School, excellent. Welcome, Gumine Secondary School. That's great to meet you as well. Fantastic. Excellent. Well, while we get some responses from the other schools, perhaps we should do a bit of an introduction of everything. We're going to be taking you through a unit on Indigenous astronomy, and over the next 3 sessions you will be, we'll talk a little bit about oral traditions and memory and explore some astronomical, not astrological, astronomical phenomena such as eclipses and meteorites and constellations, and explore some of the oral traditions that are very particular to I guess the part of Australia that we're from. Yep. So I think that might be a nice segue into doing a bit of an acknowledgement of country.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this is a really common practice for us here in Australia, that before we start formal events, usually when we're all gathering, particularly from new sort of different places, that we do pay respect to the land upon which we are on. And so in the case of Mrs. Bohni and myself, or Jade, we're currently on the lands of the Boomerang people of the Kulin Nations. And so we'd like to pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their continued connection to these lands, which were never ceded. So.
Thank you for that. You might have similar practices in your local communities. If you do, we'd love to know about them. So feel free to share anything in the chat feed. If you have something similar in PNG in the regions that you're from, we'd love to learn about them as well. I think it's really important that we kind of acknowledge the fact that, you know, we will be talking about Indigenous perspectives from countries or in Australia that we're familiar with and that we have knowledge of. But when it comes to our understanding and knowledge of PNG communities, we actually don't know that much, but we would love to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay. So thank you for understanding that. So a little bit about ourselves. Just so you know who we are. I'm a teacher at John Monash Science School. I've been teaching science now probably for about 10 years, probably longer than 10 years actually, probably closer to 15, which is, and I've been teaching science at John Monash and a few other schools around the place. My speciality is actually biology. I'm a biology teacher, but I have also recently begun exploring Indigenous science as well with Krystal. And Krystal will tell you a bit about herself now.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Krystal. I'm a Gomeroi woman, so I'm Aboriginal, and that plays a pretty big part as to why these topics are so important to me. In terms of qualifications, I'm I guess an astrophysicist. I teach astrophysics and I do astrophysics research. And when it comes to Indigenous astronomy, you can probably see why this field is so important to me as an Aboriginal woman who loves the skies. This being able to educate others on our knowledge, I find is really important, particularly in Australia where we have a lot of misinformation about what Aboriginal culture is like. And so it's very important to be able to have these types of discussions and have these topics in our classrooms. And my recent achievement is co-authoring a book on the topic. So I've written a book with another Gomeroi astronomer called Carly Noon, and our book is called Astronomy, Sky Country, and it's all about Indigenous astronomy and our experiences in education.
Which I think perhaps, and Nicole, perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the students have access to?
Yeah, that's right. So all the PNG schools have a copy of the book, and Australian schools, it was sent in the post just yesterday. So all schools should have access to the book.
Wow, thank you. That's I didn't know that. That's cool. That's
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic book. So that will be, I guess, covering some of the things that are in the book as well. So hopefully that'll be a good incentive to have a deep read of that.
Yeah.
I can see that we've got, I'm just reading the chat feed. Excellent, yeah.
Also, I don't know. For example, if we are hard to understand, because I speak very fast all the time because I get very excited. So if you'd like me to slow down, just let me know in the chat and I would understand. But it's very welcome. Yeah.
Yes. So one thing we'd like to do just to start things off is we'd like to have a bit of a reflection before we get things going on what you're hoping to learn about during this course. Now, I do understand that we have some larger groups, but if you could have a bit of a discussion within your schools and just have maybe a think for a moment about what you're hoping to learn about in this course. What's one thing that you're really keen to learn about? And if you could perhaps share that as a discussion with the other members of your class. And then after a couple of minutes, perhaps we'll get you to perhaps type in some of those things into the chat feed to share with us. That would be really, really nice. Actually, we could even unmute them.
Yeah.
We might even try unmuting a few of you as well we can't unmute people. Sorry, I've just been told by our producer that we're not allowed to unmute you. I'm really sorry. But we will definitely share some of your ideas in the chat feed. So if you could just pop them in the chat feed, that would be fantastic. And we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Excellent. Welcome back. I hope some of you had a chance to have some good discussions. I've just been trying to work out how we can actually talk to you, and I think that are you able to each unmute yourselves? Is that the idea? Oh, okay. That makes it even easier. Great. So thank you for the people who've put something in. We've got, so Kanchan has said how the knowledge of astronomy was used by Indigenous people for their survival. Yeah. That's a really good question. And actually, I was just talking to Krystal about that. You know, I said, will we be actually addressing that?
And it's definitely woven throughout every workshop. The skies you'll find, we'll talk about it a lot in this class in particular, but the skies are really important when it comes to Aboriginal knowledges. We call like knowledge systems, because it's not just usually a piece of knowledge, but it's more that our knowledges are so interconnected. They are so joint to one another, understanding the skies, understanding the land, understanding things that we need to know to survive. It's all so tightly related. That the skies are an important part of that. And so throughout this, we're going to learn about a lot of things that you would need to understand about your environment to be able to survive, that the skies can actually tell us, like from things being able to predict weather, be able to understand cycles with our animals and food resources and our water sources, and also to be able to navigate across country, because we have a huge continent here. It's massive, but we also know very confidently that Aboriginal communities have traded right across the country. So to be able to navigate vast distances as well. So we will be addressing survival through all these different topics, all the things you need to be able to thrive in the environment.
And also we have Irene's put what we can learn about the different stars and fascinating facts about them, like what makes them twinkle and their history. I can guarantee, Irene, that we will definitely be covering some of this. And I think you'll be absolutely blown away with some of the information that is stored in oral traditions about the stars and the history and it's going to be really good. You're going to love this. As we teach in Year 7, no worries, Kanchan. Yeah, we'll definitely be able to give you something as well for that. Fantastic. So we're really excited to get started. So thank you for those of you who shared something. And, don't be afraid to pop things into the chat feed. Even if something comes up further on in the lesson and you would like to say, oh, I really want to know if we're going to learn about this, by all means, please, that'd be great. Okay, so today we're going to be exploring 3 important themes, the themes of orality, memory, and interconnectedness. Now, these terms, some of them might be familiar to you, things like memory. Maybe you can tell in the word orality, we've got something to do with oral skills, so something to do with speaking. So maybe these terms might seem familiar to you, but maybe some might not be so familiar. Interconnectedness, this idea that things are connected with each other and not separated so much. So we're going to explore these themes as we go through today's lesson. Before we start, let's have a bit of another think. I do like to get everyone thinking. Where is most of our information stored in our society? So if you were to think about where you get your information from, if you have a burning question, maybe you really want to know the name of that actor that was in that movie, or perhaps you really want to know what plastic is made up of.
Or why the sky is blue.
Okay, yeah, let's try and relate this to the skies. Yeah, why is the sky blue? Why do the stars twinkle? Where would you go for that information? Where would you get that information? So perhaps just as a bit of a chat, where do you find your information as a group? And we might try unmuting people. So if you want to share where you get your information from, perhaps you can just I'm not sure the best way to do this normally, if you just unmute yourselves as you're ready. Yep. Excellent. I'd love to know. I know where I get my information from. Where do you get your information from? You can't say.
I feel like mine might be very similar to yours as well.
Yeah.
Doesn't everyone just Google?
Oh, doesn't everyone just Google the answers? I'm fairly confident that most people would just Google the answers. Perhaps if you Google the answers, can you put yes, I do into the chat feed? Yes, we Google the answers. That'd be, yes, again, Google is fantastic for that. Yep. Oh, there's thumbs up emoticons. You guys, we get Brett, a hell yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, there's definitely a hell yes. Anywhere else? Does anybody get their information from places other than Google? Do we have any other, crazy people out there that get their information from other sources? Textbooks, Kanchan, you actually go and you read some books. That's fantastic. Fact books, yep. Oh, Mesley, I love this. Most of the information in our society is stored in the nature or the environment. Is it Meslin? I'm not sure. Sorry. Can I get you to unmute yourself and just elaborate a little bit on that? Because that is really interesting. I'm not sure if you're able to.
Hi everyone, good afternoon.
Hi.
That's National School of Excellence. So here, that's the representative we, in the past, since Papua New Guinea is a diverse country filled with a lot of cultures and customs and beliefs, passed from generation to generation, and also these beliefs include a belief about the universe. Usually these beliefs and all that, they pass down through our grandparents and through storytelling and orally, yes. And but since now we're moving into a modern world and technology world, we are using, when we come to school, we usually go to libraries and all that, and also Google, we surf the internet and we get the accurate, meaning and understanding of the universe. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I've got a grin because that is so much similarity with the way that a lot of our communities operate as well, and in particular the way that we can communicate information from an oral culture, from our histories. And as well as similarly with mentioning the grandparents as well, that's a very similar way of communicating information in our families, looking towards our grandparents to provide that teaching.
Yeah.
It's so very
that was very. I was really excited to see that come up actually, because when a lot of the time, and as you mentioned, in modern society, we more and more we are relying on textbooks and, well, maybe not textbooks, that's kind of gone, but relying on Google. And I do actually notice that Brett's also put in there, and Sophie as well, like family and specialists, like, when people are teaching you something directly, which is actually kind of a bit like an oral tradition in oral. It's a very oral sort of thing to teach. When we're teaching, we do tend to talk. But the source of that information is often coming from books and from the internet, whereas as Meslin pointed out, that it's actually there are other ways of getting information, which is really cool. So let's jump into this idea of orality.
So to give a bit of a background on Aboriginal culture, and so it sounds like there's going to be some similarities, particularly from the stuff that Meslin shared about orality in the way that we share information. So we are known as the world's longest continuing culture. Aboriginal communities have had at least 65,000 years plus. This is a date that keeps jumping. I've written 80,000. I know that some researchers are putting that number now around 120,000, but it's a very, very long time spent on these lands. And in that time, we have had these communities blossom with a very long understanding of science and everything coming along with that. And as you can see from this picture that we've included here to the right, this is actually what we call the IATSIS map. So IATSIS is a research centre in Australia focusing on Aboriginal culture. And this is a map that they constructed in trying to show the diversity of language groups or diversity of nations across this continent. So when we talk about Aboriginal Australia, it is often that word sort of, I'd say this is like another long word, but homogenizes us. Like it sort of puts us all together as though we might be one people with similar ideas and histories and knowledges, which isn't an accurate way of looking at Aboriginal Australia. We have 250 different languages to start off with. And so these aren't dialects, these are distinct languages. And with each of these languages comes a community that is as unique as any other. So I like to give the example in Australia to make people start to think about Aboriginal countries as this massive continent, is that it's better to compare to other continents across the world. So you know, having countries like, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Yeah, like if you're giving Europe, for example, and even seeing like how countries like Germany and France might be neighboring one another, and yet they have very different languages, and people wouldn't usually say that they have an identical culture. And that's very similar for us and our communities. So we have at least 250 different distinct countries, and then we also have a bunch of up to 700 different dialects and clans that are within those countries. So very large, many people, many different distinct groups, all with their own understanding of how the world works and what their lives have been like. And so the one thing that they all have in common is the fact that they are oral cultures, and so information is transmitted orally. And what's phenomenal is that we know a lot of these stories, we call them oral traditions because it's got a lot more depth than stories, but stories is a good way of just sort of describing it for now. But we call them dreaming stories, and we tend to actually encode all of our information into these stories. And what's amazing is we can actually tell that these stories have been transmitted for tens of thousands of years because they describe events that occur in the skies and events that occur on the land that we as scientists can also date back. So things like volcanic eruptions and like meteorite impacts are described in dreaming stories, and sea level rise. There's so many different examples, and we will explore them in the coming workshops. So for an oral culture, this is just essentially when a community's cultural and historical traditions are passed down by word of mouth or other forms of communication. So quite commonly, this is through things like dancing, song, artwork, and a lot of our tools and artifacts. So you can see them sort of off to the right. Message sticks in which you can paint a story into. And so story is going to be the main focus for us because story is actually what we encode our science into. So when it comes to our cultures or oral cultures in general, these stories tend to be the vessel that we put our science into. So a lot in Australia, most people, when they hear about dreaming stories, particularly when they're younger, I'm just talking about from my experiences and the experiences of my generation, so it could be different for others. But when we heard about Aboriginal culture in class, it is very, it's, I guess it's like an inaccurate way of portraying Aboriginal culture due to a lack of understanding by our teachers.
So, and when we often call them Dreamtime stories. It's in the past has been kind of synonymous with fairy tales, things that are made up, and there's this element of fancy to them, and myth, a bit of myth, which we're learning now because we're learning now that there's actually a lot more depth to these oral traditions and so much complex information that has been stored in them that we can access and that we can use, which is amazing.
Yeah. And the nature of those stories in being like sort of like fairy tales that are very mythical and attention grabbing, like they are, we see similar stories around the world, things that are just like, really grand tales of some sort of accomplishment or some sort of crazy mythical creature. They're all described in such a way to make it interesting to you. So these stories aren't just mythical stories. They're actually a way that we can represent certain types of scientific concepts or, important information from our communities in a way that can be very interesting and stick in the mind of everyone who hears it. And what we can also do is we can tell the story at different levels of complexity. So we'll explore this further with real examples later into these slides. But we can have a story that we can pack layers of meaning into, and we can tell it as complicated as we want to, so that someone like a specialist like Mrs. Bohni, Jade, sorry, I have to make a decision on what I call you.
Yes, I think so.
I'll call you Jade.
Just call me Jade, it's fine.
For Jade, I could tell her a story as complex as I want to because I know that she will be able to absorb that sort of understanding. Whereas if I'm trying to maybe say it to some of the kids or someone else who may be unfamiliar with science, I can tell that story in sort of a less detailed version. That's the appeal with these stories. They're interesting enough to stick in your mind. We can be very creative with the way that we store science into them, and we can also tell them at different levels of complexity depending on who we're talking to. So it's different from what people in Australia are used to, but by sounds from what Meslin shared, it might be very similar to your culture and the way that you may that may actually communicate information. So yeah, cool.
So we've just got a bit of a task. So if you are following along with your workbooks, student workbooks, one of the first task there is asking you to reflect on this question. Why do you think modern societies are less likely to accept knowledge and information that has been sourced from an oral culture? So perhaps if you could all, just individually, have a write down on a piece of paper, a couple of dot points. Why do you think in modern society we're less likely to maybe accept knowledge and information that has been told in the form of a story? Okay, what things might lead to this attitude? Okay, and then we'll give you a couple of seconds to write things down, and then we'll get you perhaps to share. It's not an easy question. You might want to think about stories that you know about, maybe tales that are told, maybe somebody's told you about, a monster or something. I don't know. When I was a kid, this is why I'm thinking, when I was a kid, my friends' older siblings used to tell us that there was like a monster living down in the park, and being a kid, I believed them. As an adult now, I'm like going, if somebody tells me a story about a monster, I'm like going, oh, it's a bit, thing. But so why might we be less likely to accept knowledge from stories people tell us? Okay. We've got something in the chat feed. Kansha said, trust on the information. Ooh, Betty has put, it can be biased from the person telling the story. Yes, I really like that one. Yeah, because perhaps the reason why they told me there were monsters in the park was because they didn't want me to play with them. I don't know why anybody would want to do that. We think this because through timepieces of the true story might be missing because people have different versions or opinions of telling it. Irene, that's really interesting that you've put that, because, yeah, we might tell a story one way and then hear it another way perhaps, and that might make us think, oh, well, if it's been told orally, then maybe that information's inaccurate if I'm hearing it different ways. Level of mistrust amongst modern society. So, Brett, sorry, can I get you perhaps to elaborate on that? Do you just mean just generally modern society's a bit mistrustful?
Yeah, I'm just tending to think over the years that sadly people in authority have misused their power as such that the spoken word from people that you should trust, people have tended to lose that ability to be able to accept that, because let's face it, it'd be fair to say that many people tell lies these days.
Yeah, it's this idea of lie telling, maybe from people that we should be able to trust, misinforming us.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a big problem nowadays, actually.
Yeah. I think it is. It's an interesting issue, and maybe if you've got time to explore this idea of how in social media a lot of information now is being portrayed by our influencers who talk a lot to camera, and how much of what they say can we trust? Because there is a lot of misinformation out there. Yeah, interesting, really interesting issue. Getting some great things in the chat feed. I'm loving this. So we have inadequate knowledge of the past. That's a really interesting idea as well. Inadequate knowledge of the past. Betty, do you want to elaborate on what you've shared in the chat feed? This idea of inadequate knowledge of the past from you, Betty. But that's okay. I think maybe perhaps what they were talking about, this idea of inadequate knowledge of the past, maybe because we have lost perhaps some of our knowledge of our history, because especially in Australia, and we're speaking about our Aboriginal communities here, a lot of their knowledge has been taken because of the invasion. So I think that perhaps maybe that's kind of what they were getting at, maybe we are losing some of our past and because we're losing some of that.
There's a pretty significant disruption. So a lot of for example, in our communities, a lot of these oral traditions have been passed along, like these stories have been passed along very carefully with very strict sort of protocol on who can share the knowledge and in what ways and how that is conducted. And of course, invasion, the last 200 years of attempting to assimilate Aboriginal communities into Australian society has really attempted to sort of disrupt the continuation of a lot of our knowledges. And so there is a bit of a, I was going to say disruption again. Yeah. There has been a little bit of, there's things that are definitely lost and there's a lot of things that are being reconstructed, and there are a lot of knowledges that have been able to thrive still. So it is that does add an extra layer of toughness to current acceptance of Aboriginal knowledge.
Yeah. I've also like what Richard's put in here, because of the advancement of technology and development, people may not trust those tales. Yeah. We go, oh, well, we've got this incredible technology now, we should trust the technology. And maybe that's at the detriment of the knowledge that we've been able to store for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Okay. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. The next thing we'd like you to do is to have a bit of again, if you refer to your student manual, you'll see there's a question there about when did the written word emerge. So I might just quickly see if I can. When did the written word emerge? When do you think? So I think we have a couple of options there, and I forgot to pop these into the slide deck. There we go. Yeah, 3,300 years ago, 5,500 years ago, 11,000 years ago, or 55,000 years ago. So if you could put your guesses as a collective into the chat feed, and let's have a look at what you guys think. How long ago? Thank you for that, Nicole. 3,300 years ago, 55,000 years. So Iran's gone the longest. It's been around for a long, long, long time. Kancha has said no, they think it was a relatively new.
Yeah, we've got both extremes of the answers. The most early one and like the most recent and the longest dating back.
Anyone think 5,500? I reckon I would have said, I mean, I know the answer now, but when I was first asked this question, I reckon I would have said 5,500 years ago. Yeah, see, Richard, Brett, you're on the same page as me. Well, I think I kind of gave it away, though, when I said that I knew what the answer was, but I guessed it, and now we're going to find out. Let's find out. How long ago did the written word emerge? So, we're talking a lot about talking, but now we're talking about, okay, when did we actually start writing? Okay, when did we actually start writing? And the answer is about 3,500 years ago.
Or BCE, so actually 5,500.
Oh, okay, so we were right.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, the adding of the extra 2,000 years, I forget that too.
Yeah.
So I find this an interesting point to raise, because it is good to gauge what the perception is by people learning about oral cultures or discussing oral cultures, and how long they think cultures around the world have been engaging with writing information down. So these were the earliest estimates that seem to be agreed upon. So I don't know if I pronounce it right, but the cuneiform in Mesopotamia, as well as the hieroglyphs in for ancient Egypt. These are, I guess, that sort of step up from the distinction between what's art, what's simply a painting, versus now, okay, we have some sort of symbolism to represent concepts that we'd usually vocalize. And so to some, this can be quite surprising as well. And I think particularly when we talk about Aboriginal culture being at least 65,000 years, now more likely seeming at least 120,000 years, the written word in comparison is actually relatively recent. And for a lot of cultures around the world, would rely on being an oral culture prior to something.
Most cultures would have relied on being oral cultures for many, many thousands of years.
Before developing
language. So the idea of oral traditions is not new. It's actually a really old mechanism for storing knowledge and transferring knowledge.
And this is a thing that is, I think, important to bring up at this point. We don't explicitly cover it at another, but one thing we like to talk about when we talk about Aboriginal knowledges is also the development of technologies. So some people tend to see like the evolution of cultures around the world as being some sort of linear path where we all must take the same steps towards some type of advanced society, right? But in actuality, the reason certain technologies develop is because of the needs of those communities. And a lot of things that have actually led to the advancement of really cool phones and computers and other technology have actually been things like wars, very intense times in certain countries' lives where the need for greater technologies is really, really encouraged, given what's going on in their climate. And so when it comes to Aboriginal culture, 65,000 plus years, the written word never emerged as a necessary technology because of the way in which information had been communicated. So it's not necessarily saying it's lesser than, it's just a different way of engaging with information that we tend to have a bit of a bias against because we're so used to the ways that we have now. So I think that's something that's important to point out, but I also feel like this may be less of a foreign concept to you as listeners than it is to people in our classrooms, because there seems to be a respect for oral traditions already.
Yeah. So the next sort of thing that we want to look at is this idea of memory and just how long we can record information for. So I'm just mindful of time.
Yeah, we can skip.
I think we might just talk about memory a little bit. Yeah.
So this is a huge topic that we are going to go over pretty briefly because it is a really important component of Aboriginal cultures and the way that we transmit knowledge in Aboriginal systems. But we are trying to focus on Indigenous astronomy. So we're just trying to give you some of the foundational concepts before we can jump into things that are very exciting for us. But cultures around the world have come up with very genius ways of being able to store information. And we will explore them in a bit more depth in around workshop 3 when we start talking about that concept of songlines. And you can sort of see already that word down there at the bottom. So a lot of cultures come up with really genius ways of transmitting and storing information. The story example that we gave earlier is a perfect example, creating a narrative that's really interesting, quite fantastical, can use that symbolism from those exciting aspects to encode information into, and it'll be something that sticks in our brains. We'll get into songlines and everything else in later ones, but a couple ways of things just to bring to note. Aboriginal communities tend to be very multilingual. We have 250 different languages and we have vast trade routes and interactions. So most communities and most people would be multilingual prior to colonization. The stats that I've heard would be at least, say around 5 languages would be very normal for you to know, and it may be a greater number if you actually needed to be traveling and interacting with other communities more often. We have very complex knowledge systems like things like songlines, which all tie into one another. So it's not information that's unimportant. It's information you need to remember to understand your environment and to be able to survive in it. So it has a strong purpose. We also have knowledge that is divided by age, specialty, and even having men's and women's business. So different people in the community will take care of knowledge and play their role to make sure that it remains accurate and can be transferred to future generations.
And I think that's really important to kind of, to remember, is that because these oral traditions contain so much complex information, that when we're passing on that information, that the stories have to be retold in very specific ways. And often they're stored not only in stories, but also maybe songs stored in actual locations. And we talk about songlines a bit, songlines a bit later. We'll see how they're even encoded in the stars as well. So and those things are required in order to be able to transmit it. So when you have issues where you are having land being cleared or changed, when you have light pollution, which is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's when we have so much light from our urban cities that it actually starts to block out the light coming from the stars. Then we start to have a loss of the ability to transfer that information. It's really, oral traditions are really reliant on certain things to help to transfer those memories.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So an example is that we can, when we're talking about stories and we're talking about how we can encode science into a story, one way we can do that is by having the characters in the story actually represent celestial phenomena. So like talking about whether they are literally objects in the sky, so these characters representing those objects, or if they're representing an effect or something that happened in the skies. So whether that be a shooting star or some things that we will cover, I think, in the next lessons, like moon halos. So something that's not really a physical object, but something that sort of is like an illusion sort of created in our atmosphere, you know, something that doesn't last very long. So we can use characters in the story to be able to represent those objects or ideas. And for example, one tradition, which is from my community, so Gomeroi or Gamilaroi, talks about the way that the sun woman, so talking about the way the sun and the moon move across our skies. And a way that we can do that is by representing the sun as a sun woman, so a human character called Yi, and also by talking about our moon man, so as a man, whose name is Balu. And we can talk about the way those two different people interact in that story as a way to describe the way those objects are moving or interacting. And so this Gomeroi tradition talks about the fact that this sun woman has seen the moon man and she thinks he's so beautiful that she decides to pursue him across the skies. And this image that we can see here is actually a number of really significant objects in our skies. These happen to be the visible planets, so the planets that we can most commonly see in an unlight polluted Australia. So in clear, dark skies, seeing Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter. And because of the setup of our solar system, because of the fact that we're all orbiting around our sun in a very similar plane, so that's just the word to say that we're all sort of on the same floor or all sort of on the same level, because we're all orbiting around the sun in that way, and even our moon is orbiting us in that direction, that we are going to have these objects, the planets and our moon, traveling along this path. So the sun's path, all these objects travel along. And in the story, it talks about how the sun woman is chasing the moon man as he makes his way across the skies, and she does too. And it says how he tries to zigzag to try and get away from her. And what these are describing are actually really important physical, like things that we can observe about those objects. So the nature of the moon man trying to run away from the sun woman, this is occurring because, they're traveling along not only the same path across the sky, so this line, but also that moon actually does travel a degree or so faster across our sky than what the sun does, which is a surprise to me. We would notice that. People would notice that who pay careful attention to the skies and are constantly observing them. Another aspect is that it said the moon zigzags. The moon zigzags to sort of get away from the sun. And so this is another...
That might be a bit easier to
nice.
say, yeah.
Sorry. So the moon actually, it says it zigzags away from the sun. And this is quite accurate. As you can see, even in this image right here, these objects aren't perfectly on the sun's path. At the moment, actually, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, they're all above this line in the sky. But sometimes they may be a bit below it. It's just a variation that we see. So sometimes the moon is actually either above or below the sun's path, trying to sort of escape her. So this one story can talk about these two characters, but it's actually describing these physical events. And the story or the tradition actually finishes by saying how the moon man sort of changes his mind. He notices how beautiful the sun woman is, and he decides to cover her in an embrace. And so this, once again...
What do you think that it might represent? Yeah, let's see. If the moon is covering the sun in an embrace, what might that be talking about? And Irene, sorry, thank you for sharing what you have shared about PNG being a multilingual nation. 800 plus languages,
Oh, wow.
That's incredible.
Wow.
That is amazing. Yeah, and absolutely what you've said there about it, it's easier to tell a story through acting it out. And Irene, does that mean that like is dance and song a very important part of a lot of your community, your culture?
Yes, it's very important. We have a diverse of cultures and beliefs, so we present it whenever we gather all together, and then we can present present it to tell it to the other culture, other people from other countries, and also in our own country as well.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. Yeah, and so just to get back to what we're talking about, so we've got a few people there, eclipses, lunar and solar eclipses.
Yeah. So and that's what the description is. And that's like I guess like a little taster as well of the longevity, like so the length of time in which we can pass along these stories. Because I told you before in the earlier part of this workshop that we actually do have examples of just tens of thousands of years ago of events that have occurred that have been described in story and then been able to be dated back using science, using modern technologies. But this is another good example of a phenomena that you need to have seen yourself, or someone who has seen it has to have seen it to be able to tell you about it. And these are very rare. Like lunar eclipses, not so rare. We see them quite often. So that's when the Earth's sort of blocking the sun. But in this description, what we're seeing here is the moon man sort of covering the sun in an embrace, so describing a solar eclipse. And they are very rare. I've never seen one. I would like to. But in any one region, at least in our part of the world, they can occur 400 years between. So it's just pretty wild. Pretty crazy, sorry to admit. So it's an example of a story that has been passed along by people who've seen that.
Yeah, and it also suggests, like even with the earlier part of the story where the moon man is zigzagging across the sky, like that involves a lot of tracking and watching and observing and a lot of collation of data in order to be able to notice that and to put it into story.
And we have people in our communities who are dedicated to the skies quite often, and we even have elders who still still thriving, sharing knowledge, who still have such an intimate knowledge of the sky that apparently they can actually name like all the thousands of visible stars in the sky to this day, because that's how intimately you would know the skies. And you'd be able to notice that when certain stars were changing in their appearance compared to what they usually would or compared to their neighbors, and also to see where, for example, the planets are moving compared to the backdrop of stars, because the planets move a lot more because they're closer and the stars stay very consistent. So there is a really intimate knowledge that I can't relate to because, as we said earlier in the workshop, we have the luxury of being able to Google a lot of our information. And so I find with that, we are not forced to absorb the level of detail that our communities have needed to be able to thrive to where they are.
Okay. So we're going to come to now our last theme, which is this idea of interconnectedness. Does anybody may perhaps want to share what they think the word interconnectedness means? Like, what does the word interconnectedness mean to you? So perhaps just in your classes, does anybody want to, you don't have to know what we're about to talk about, but if you hear the word interconnected, what does that kind of mean to you? And feel free to either put it in the chat feed or just unmute yourself to share. Either's fine. Oh, Kanchan, feel alive. Kanchan, can I get perhaps somebody to elaborate on what you mean by feel alive? If you can unmute yourself. Marites has put depend on one another. I like that, yeah. Irene has the idea of connecting different people or things together regardless of their origin and nature. Really nice. Different people with different cultures coming together for one common aim. So when you communicate to people and you get responses from them, you feel part of society. So a way of maybe connecting us to each other. I'm getting this theme from all these responses that, this connecting people to other people, connecting people to nature as well is another theme that is coming through. Brett's put like an ecosystem, different components within all being connected. That's fine, Kanchan. That's fine. Yeah, like this idea of things being connected to each other. Very Betty, you've summarized it. Yeah, this idea that's the kind of theme that we're getting. Yeah, excellent. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that's a really, it's interesting. We probably don't use that word a lot, but it's something that's so important in society, just generally.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about interconnectedness, we're talking about this idea that oral traditions, they contain this idea. We've spoken about it already, really. This idea that they contain a lot of complex information. But perhaps we haven't really spoken about this idea that they contain different types of information in one story.
Yeah, so this is something that we bring to attention when we teach this because of the way that knowledge tends to be taught in our classrooms. So comparing, once again, Australian sort of ways of approaching education and also Indigenous ways of approaching knowledge in general as well. So in our classrooms, we tend to do a lot of what we call compartmentalizing, putting everything into its own little compartment. So its own little box. And so, we're talking about usually astronomy specifically, and we focus on those concepts. We might teach mathematics and focus on what maths is. And even though we know that there are links between maths and astronomy, we don't tend to explore them because it's easier just to keep everyone on track with this one way of focusing.
Do you have similar things in your schools when you teach? You teach one subject at a time, one topic at a time? You might teach history. We're going to learn about history today. And then maybe later on we're gonna learn about how to write, or then we're gonna learn about, I don't know, art. We're gonna do art, And
I understand the reasoning for why people would choose to explore topics and teach people in that sort of way. It's very neat. It's all tucked into its box, and you can focus on what you feel you need to. When it comes to Aboriginal knowledges, it does make it pretty complicated because I talk about Aboriginal astronomy all the time, but what becomes very apparent pretty quickly is that I'm never only talking about astronomy because it's just impossible to do when it comes to Aboriginal knowledge systems. They are interconnected in the way that our sky knowledge is fundamentally really tied to any knowledge that's coming from the land, to do with our animals, to do with our plants, to do with weather and seasons. Everything. It's so tightly connected. It tells us a lot of information we need to know, or it might just be a reference point that stores our information. So how I said before, we use these stories, these oral traditions to put our knowledge into. And quite often those stories will have some type of link to the skies, whether it can be something that's very important, or it can just be, okay, so when we talk about this idea, this animal, for example, there might be a star that links to that animal. And so when we talk about it, we say, yeah, we see him pass in the sky, and it has something to do with the animal on the ground. Sorry, I just lost my thought for 2 seconds. So when I think of the skies and when we try and talk about them, it's better to compare them as though the sky is like a library and the stars are like our books, and they can help us unlock that information we need to know. And so with interconnectedness, I like to give this example of imagining like you have a fine piece of thread. I just need to check if this is on the slides or not, or whether it's just me. Cool. So it's imagining we have a fine piece of thread. So I have it like a needle and some string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pierce my needle and this string through bits of knowledge that I'm learning. And so I can start off by saying, okay, all right, I'm going to look at a particular star in the sky. It's a very nice star. In particular, the star that comes to mind for me, if I'm going to be specific, it'll be something that we cover, but I might think of the Seven Sisters, which is like a cluster of stars called the Pleiades, which are relevant and come up in the understandings of groups around the world. So we all look at this very interesting cluster of little stars. And over time, I go out and I look at my beautiful stars, maybe every night across the year, and I'm going to notice that they move. When I go out at the same time every night, they're not always in the same spot. When it comes to winter, they actually completely disappear from my view. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pierce my knowledge from this idea of this star to also this concept of the fact that this star's moving. And it's moving over time, and it's moving on a cycle, so I see it come back. So I'm starting to, take this thread, and I'm making a bit of a bracelet, I guess, at this point of knowledge that interlinks. At the same time, though, I'm also noticing changes in my environment. I'm noticing that the fact that where these stars are sort of correlates to when I'm experiencing a lot of heat, like so a hot season in Australia. But then at other times, it might be very cold, very frosty. And so I'm starting to bring these links down of piercing it with my knowledge of our wet weather, our knowledge of our hot weather, the knowledge of the way that the grasses are changing and what's happening with our plants, what's happening with our animals. And so after a while, we realize that this knowledge from this star really ties into a lot of other processes on the ground. and that my little thread that was making a bracelet has actually started to go out in all directions, that it's really becoming like a woven blanket instead, something that's like a mat. So that's a good way of thinking about it, because when we start talking about knowledges, you can be learning about some sort of animal, native animal, and you'll find that actually sometimes the stars inform about different cycles for that animal, and something to do with the land as well. So it's all very connected, essentially.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful analogy.
Thank
I
you.
love that. It's really lovely.
So to give some sort of examples of the types of information that our stories can tell us, particularly stories that relate to astronomy, I've given 8 different examples of the types of topics. So the first one is that our skies can tell us about our animals. So in particular, there is this feature called the emu in the sky, and we can sort of see it here. This is actually seen as an emu bird's head, this black nebula, very dark nebula. And then we can see a sort of like beak feature here. And then we have this long neck that goes down to the body of the emu. So the emu in the sky is a really important feature. We'll explore it in more detail, but essentially this part of the sky can actually tell us about important cycles to do with our animals on the ground. We can also have our stars tell us about our plants. So I said before about the Pleiades and how interesting they are. I find them fascinating. They're a focus of mine in particular. I know that for Ngarrindjeri community, that the rising of the Pleiades, so when we can see them in the morning, so this is a particular time of year where we start to see them rise when we wake up, and then they disappear as the sun comes up and takes away our beautiful skies, beautiful stars at least. But we know that for Ngarrindjeri community, this actually means that the yam plant is blooming and ready for harvest.
And actually, while we're on this slide here, I just want to point out that we will, because we are drawing on a few different communities' knowledge, we do try to refer to them. So I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. The
Ngarrindjeri.
The Ngarrindjeri community is one of our Indigenous communities, and that information pertains specifically to that community. It might be found in, that knowledge might be found in other communities. In fact, it probably definitely is found in other communities, but we are trying to acknowledge where we've sourced that particular bit of information from. So if you do see us referring to particular communities, it's because the information has come from that particular community. It will be found in other communities, but we're acknowledging where we've taken it from.
It's important, as we said earlier in the lesson about how many countries we have here, all with their different knowledge systems. We do our best to not homogenize them into one group. We are individual communities, and it's important to acknowledge where that information came from. Another thing skies can tell us about is the weather. So I sort of mentioned before about moon halos, so features that can appear in the skies that we might describe in stories. And this is an example of one. So we have different things like the twinkling of stars or the forming of moon halos, which actually tells us about the weather we're going to experience. In this case, in particular, it's rain, but we will talk about this in a bit more depth in other workshops. We can use the stars to help us navigate. So another really important skill to have, we use our stories and songs, features in the land, as well as the stars themselves to help us navigate across country. And in particular, we have the Southern Cross, which is actually a really important feature. So you sort of see it here. It's a lot of stars.
It's a lot of stars there.
A lot of stars there, but this is the Southern Cross. And it helps us actually determine where we are on country and help us to navigate across distance as we see it. Yeah, but we'll learn about that in more depth in Workshop 3. You'll be able to actually use these techniques. So another thing that the skies tell us about is also our ceremonies. So serving as a calendar so that we know when is the appropriate time of year for us to conduct important ceremony. Ceremony is an important part of most knowledge exchange. So not just initiation ceremonies, so like coming of age ceremonies in our communities for young girls and boys, transitioning into adulthood and learning the information they need to keep, but also in general conducting ceremony when you visit a new country, being welcomed onto that country, being given the information you need to understand to thrive with that community. So the skies can help guide us there. The skies also help us understand the history of the lands that we're on. So a lot of people in Australia seem to think that as Australia as a country is quite young, that we don't understand really what happened here to these lands prior to that. We don't have any like physical record really, like any written record of what happened. But through oral tradition and through our skies and other techniques, we can actually get an understanding of certain events that have occurred here. So I said in this example, the Hembury craters. So we have a crater site that was discovered in, I think it's like a central, Hembury area is like central sort of desert-ish part of Australia, very far away from where Jade and I currently are. And these communities have these descriptions of fire falling from the sky in this particular area. And so when we go out there, we look at the area. So this area where we're said not to approach because of this fire falling, we can actually recognize that this is actually an impact crater from a meteorite. And then we can actually then date that site as scientists and get this record of knowing that that story would originate over 4,000 years ago, as that's when that meteorite hit Earth. We'll go into these in a bit more detail in later workshops as well. Also, our traditions don't just tell us about science and other physical things that we need to understand about our environment, but they also are used to communicate social values. So the way that a lot of fairy tales are regarded as having some sort of moral to the story, something that you can take from it and learn. These oral traditions, these stories between these objects of stars fighting or the sun and the moon dancing across the skies, they will also usually communicate something important, some important value that our community holds to importance. Sorry,
some social norms, I guess, or rules that might help that society kind of function smoothly. What is okay to do, what isn't okay to do. So it's really they're also mechanisms for social law and order, I guess.
Definitely.
In a way.
And quite often a lot of the concepts that are important are things like consent and respecting one another. You see that theme pop up in a lot of our astronomy stories. Things about sustainable engagement with our resources. So sustainable harvesting of foods and interactions with animals. They will be communicated when these taboos get broken. Usually sometimes the stories will talk about an astronomical event coming as a sign of a sort of like a warning or an omen of that a taboo has been broken. So commonly that is associated with things like meteorites and shooting stars and stuff. So social values can be communicated as well. And then finally, we also have the focus on country. So when it comes to interconnectedness, we talk about it as though, yes, our different knowledge systems about plants and animals, seasonality and lore and history are all connected to the skies. But one of the other things that we mean when we talk about interconnectedness is that in an Aboriginal way of knowing, we see the skies and the land as two parts of a whole, something that we cannot separate. What is seen in the sky is also reflected in the land. Quite often the Milky Way itself is known as a sky river for most communities. And sometimes it's said to actually be the physical rip that we can see in the skies from when the earth and the skies used to be one, and then were torn in two. And that's sort of the point of creation. So for different communities, we'll have different interpretations, but essentially the skies are reflected in the land. And one way we see that is with this emu, which we'll go on to explore in depth.
Yeah, I think we were going to talk about that now. We have about 10 minutes left, I think. So do you want to talk a bit about dark emu? Yeah.
Whatever you're happy with thinking we can fit in.
I reckon we'll talk a little about dark emu. I think that'd be nice. So we'll see how we go with this. I think we might have to perhaps continue this, finish it off at the next session. But we might get a start on it. So what we're going to get you to do is, if you go, sorry, I'll just get my computer happening. If you have access to this document, this is called a lotus diagram. There's a couple of versions that we've sent for you. You can either print it out, and so we've provided like a grayscale version of it if you wanted to print it out, or there's a digital copy if you wanted to work digitally. So the idea is that you have your central theme in the middle. There's like 9 grids where you've got animals, plants, weather, navigation, ceremony, history, social values and country. So these are the themes that we were talking about before in the middle. And then as we go out into each of them, we have weather here. So for instance, weather we can expand, and in this spot you can type and put in some other examples to do with weather. So over here, I think we've got one on animals, and this is even too small for me to read, so I'll make that a bit bigger. So we've got, so for example, I'm giving a bit of a spoiler alert here. We've got the Gamilaroi in story with dark emu. It talks about how chicks start to develop in eggs in early June, and so that's a bit of information about animals that we have. So what we're going to get you to do is we want you to, this is going to be something that we're going to work on this session and probably cross over a little bit into the next workshop. So keep it on you. It's going to be like a document that might grow. We'd like you to include on it the story from which the country from which you're hearing it. So, for instance, in this case, this bit of information is from the Gamilaroi people, but it's also from the Ualia people, and it's relating to the dark emu constellation. And this is the information that we're getting from that oral tradition. So chicks start to develop in early June. Okay, so you can see there's 3 bits of information that we've included in each sort of box. And as we go through, you might want to add something else. So you might find another, I'm not going to go because I don't want to spoil dark emu for you. You might find out that we learned something about plants, or we learned something about navigation, and we'd like you to include it in this document. Now, it might not be from the same story, so it might not be from dark emu, it might be from one of the other oral traditions we talk about, but we'd like you to just like, let's put that in there, so that by the end of this, the next couple of workshops, you've got like a little kind of mind map of some of the stories that you've heard, and also what information was encoded in them. So yeah, and we'll reflect on that once we've done. So let's get started on a little bit of dark emu. Yeah.
So the emu in the sky is a really significant dark sky constellation. Dark sky constellations aren't the traditional constellations most people tend to think of when we say the word constellation, which is bright stars linking together to make some sort of shape like the Southern Cross. It's noted as a cross in the sky. Dark sky constellations actually look at the dark regions of the sky. And this is something that we're particularly lucky to have in the Southern Hemisphere. And so one of the most famous dark sky constellation, which is looking at those dark regions, is the emu in the sky. And I'm going to present a few different interpretations of this emu for Aboriginal communities and also communities globally. So particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, this is where we get to see a very beautiful shot of the Milky Way in our skies. For my community, we know the emu in the sky as Gawarragai. And so this is talking about the emu that's up in the Milky Way. So with that Coalsack Nebula head and beak and body that is really the bulk of that Milky Way. And it's important because it actually tells us about the emu egg, or it tells us about the emu on the ground and its emu egg cycle. I should have brought an emu egg today to convey their size.
They're quite big, aren't
they? But they are
Yeah,
humongous.
they're big eggs like this.
Huge eggs.
Yeah.
And what's beautiful as well is they have such a link to the skies, especially for my mob. At the same time, their eggs are these beautiful blue eggs with little white speckles, and it really looks like you're holding like the universe in your hands. So they're pretty neat. And so what it actually tells us about, and do we not have time? Should I tell this myself?
I think we're running out short on time.
So this is something that you could go back and watch later. We have a link to it in the documents, but it's something that I'll just describe now. The video was of a Gomeroi man, so from my community, named Ben Flick, and he was talking about the emu, and I love the way he tells it. So I'll give you a summary here instead.
We'll tell it just as well.
Of course. So on the screen, we have a panel that sort of shows what's happening to the emu in the sky throughout the year. So our skies do change. I said before how in the parts of Australia that we're in, when we look for the Southern Cross in the sky, for example, it is so close to the southern parts of the sky that it's always up in our sky. When the skies turn throughout the night, it never dips below the horizon. We always get to see the Southern Cross, and that's why it's so important to our country and to our Aboriginal communities. It's very important. But when it comes to things like the Pleiades, the 7 sisters that I said before, and I said they disappeared sort of like when it comes to the winter time, but then in the summer we see them again. This is another example of the way the skies change. That is a constellation that's closer towards the Northern Hemisphere, so it disappears at certain points of the year. So if I was to go and observe the skies at the same time, like after sunset, let's say, maybe not at the same time, but say after sunset throughout the year, when I look for the emu in the sky, it's going to have changed where it is and the way it's positioned. So this panel A here, you can think of it as A for autumn, because this is our autumn time of year, which is around, say, around like March to April. And what we're seeing if we look at the emu in the sky is we're actually seeing an emu that seems to be upright and running across our skies. It's huge. And this is actually the time of year where, so we see Guaragai up in the sky running across the skies. It's the same time of year that we see the Dinawan, which is the emu off the ground, actually running around for a mate. So this is early in the breeding season. And this is the time of year that when we see the emu like this, we know we can collect the emu eggs for our consumption. Always with a focus on sustainability, not taking too many. In panel B, this is actually something that we would be seeing around now. So if we're heading out looking for where the emu is, it's going to look like the emu is actually starting to sort of set down towards the horizon, like he's hopping down. And this is the same time of year where we actually have the Dinawan, so the male emu of the ground, starting to hop down and incubate the eggs over the nest. And so this is the time of year where we have chicks that are starting to form in the eggs, and we would stop collecting them. So in autumn, when you see the running emu, it's great. When in winter we see an emu that's starting to hop down, this is an emu that's looking after the eggs, and we would stop collecting now. In panel C, this is showing an important, this is the orientation in springtime for us, which is around September, and relates to ceremonial events for my community. And then in panel D down here, this is our summertime, so around December onwards. And what it looks like is as though the emu is actually lowering himself down into what we call the water hole of the horizon. So a lake or a body of water. And it's said to be that the emu, it's hot in summer, so the emu is doing what any of us would be trying to do, which is
trying to cool down.
And so this is a description not only for where the emu's at, but also the conditions that we're facing on the land with it being quite hot and dry, and the impact that's also having on our water sources, because it says this big emu hops down into our water hole and he pushes out all of the water. And so it's a description for those dry times of year. And so this story itself, once again, I hope you can see that we're starting to show some of the layers you might be able to put into an oral tradition. So we're talking about the way the skies change and some sort of seasonality with knowing that this is a cycle that we witness every year, but also what's happening to the animal on the ground, what's happening to our food sources, what's happening to our water sources, and what the conditions are like. It's getting hot or it's getting cold. And this is just we've been told it's like the primary school version of the story. So oral traditions have many complex layers that link into other areas of knowledge that community holds very closely. And this is just a peek into what it might look like. So this is a very similar connection that also another community, which are the Wiradjuri community, so they're sort of like a neighbour to us where we are in Australia. They also see the similar shape in the skies, but they call it Gugurman. So for my mob, it's Guaragai, for theirs it's Gugurman, but it has a very similar relationship for that part of the country, being in a similar area, associating the emu in the sky with the emu on the ground. However, when we look in other parts, I will note as well that this also relates once again to that time of year, using it like a calendar for ceremonial events. And in particular, not only does this emu, when it's in this sort of
downward position
directly down to the land, not only when it's in this position is it something that it's telling us it's the time of year to conduct the ceremony, but also the shape of the emu itself actually is related to the physical site of the ceremony. So having this bulge of the body and then the small circle for the head sort of making up the emu. We see that same shape in the land with having this main ceremonial circle for this important initiation ceremony for our boys in our community. Which also includes a trek down to a smaller, more secret circle in which important initiation events occur. But then if we look at other parts of the country as well, I'm pretty sure Boorong is a Victorian community, but I may be incorrect. But it's a different part of the country from where our communities are from. And they look at the emu in the sky, but they don't see this loving, beautiful bird that we respect and tells us about our land. But instead, they actually see this sort of like Goliath human-eating monster that's called Chingal, which is up in their skies.
Sounds terrifying.
It is. I wouldn't want to get on Chingal's bad side. And so it's interesting because we have all these communities that are looking at the same object in the skies, but have different interpretations. And another place where the emu actually pops up is in cultures around the world, cultures who get to see this beautiful Milky Way and look at the shapes within it and recognize something that they can connect to. And that's very similar with all our constellations as well. It's why we see a lot of communities around the world see the Seven Sisters or the Pleiades as a group of young women. or seeing the shape of Orion as a man or a human for other communities as well. As humans around the world, we tend to look at the same objects and we feel a human connection and come up with similar things to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I thought it, yeah.
No, so thank you. Unfortunately we have run out of time. If anybody has any questions about dark emu and what we went through today, so we went through a couple of different stories surrounding dark emu, and we kind of raced through them, so apologies about that. If we get time at the start of next lesson, we might just slow down and just go through them a little bit again, particularly the last two, so that way you have a chance to fill in any of the terms. Don't stress too much if you miss the names of the emus or the community names. I think what's really important is that you just understand that where some of these themes, where the information is landing. So, for instance, in dark emu, what information have we learnt about Indigenous, about the Gamilaroi people and their practices, their social practices, perhaps their harvesting of emu eggs practices, that sort of stuff. And perhaps you might even be able to, think ahead and think, I wonder what other information could be tied to that knowledge of the position of the emu in the sky. So something for you to think about and reflect on. Our next lesson, we will be diving a lot more into these stories. So we're going to be looking at, I think it was eclipses and meteorites. We're going to be looking at the Pleiades, which we've mentioned a few times in a lot more detail. So thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to working with you again next session.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. Thanks for the responses and hope you've enjoyed.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, everyone.